going on after Sebastian and Eric is a little stressful. And also being like the first and last, delivering the first and last papers of the conference is kind of stressful too. Anyway, and this paper, I mean, people probably kind of know what I'm going to talk about because I've been tweeting and I've also blogged a lot about this. And so my paper today is a sort of an evolution of a paper that I've been writing for really since Eric Paler's conference with a similar theme at the University of Massachusetts last year. In fact, my travel to University of Massachusetts sort of triggered these thoughts. So there's one of these spring snowstorms, and then I had to ride in a car from Hartford to, oh wait, this is Richard Rothfuss calling, by the way. We do this to each other when we're on the radio or giving a public talk, and I just wanted to acknowledge that he has called me. In any event, anyway, so this is the evolution of a paper. My blog has probably the earlier versions of this, so this will have ties in with that in order to kind of understand its larger context. And what I want to try to focus on today, as I'm thinking about this thing I like to call slow archaeology, is parsing a little bit the thoughts on digital practices in archaeology into three sort of related lines. And I'm kind of a Luddite, right? But not in the sense that I use digital tools all the time. I mean, I do GIS, we use iPads in the field, I use databases, I'm familiar with all this stuff. But I think I've just sort of maybe developed over the last half decade a sort of skepticism toward it. And it probably comes from, a larger skepticism about the entire sort of new archaeology project, which I see a lot of digital archaeology sort of deeply involved in. So first and foremost, I continue to have a strong interest in the way that digital tools are shaping field practice. This involves everything from the physical orientation of the archaeologist toward the trench or survey unit to the time spent on various procedures. I want to briefly consider also the interplay of digital parts as part of a larger digital ecosystem, of digital tools as part of a larger digital ecosystem. And the interplay between tools in this ecosystem and how this shapes the potential of digital tools and the ways that they're used. So these things can't be atomized. And I think a lot of the papers in here have assumed this. I don't think this is necessarily ubiquitous within, say, published scholarship. I think we still see a lot of, I got this problem, and this is the tool I'm going to use to fix this problem. And I'm not sure that's an approach, that's probably an approach that we should be outgrowing. Because the distinct workflows required of an increasingly digital practice extends to shape the social and spatial organization of archaeology in particular. So for the final section of the paper, I'd like to reflect on the physical space of archaeological objects in a digital world. The use of digital tools has allowed us to produce portable digital surrogates of archaeological objects. And for some of these ideas, I'm getting them from a little essay that Adam Rabinowitz wrote and that we published just this winter in this little Visions of Substance book. So if you want to read more about it, he's much smarter than me and developed these ideas. And of course, they go back to Walter Benjamin's ideas of art in the age of mechanical reproduction and things like that. So they're going to be familiar to a lot of people in the room. Anyway, so when we carry these digital objects away from their physical context, what happens when we're doing this? Recent advances in 3D scanning, for example, has allowed us to reconstruct almost entire archaeological environments on our laptops and mobile devices. My hope is that by introducing an idea of slow archaeology, it goes beyond just being a little more deliberate in the field, but it's actually maybe a useful term or a useful umbrella term. I mean, I'm not trying to convince people to use it, but it's a way that I'm trying to slow down a little bit and to think deliberately about our work as archaeologists as well as the tools we use and the objects we study, this kind of larger relationship. So anyway, earlier versions of this paper have emphasized the profoundly modern character of archaeology as a discipline. Archaeological practice over the past century has appealed to modern methods ranging from the adoption of photography and standards of technical drawing to the organization of labor along industrial lines. Artifacts of craft persist in the discipline, of course. But as Latour reminds us, and as Latour reminds us, we have never been modern, right? So archaeology has always had this kind of conflicted relationship with these kind of these modernist principles. And I think this has become exaggerated in some ways by the arrival of new archaeology in the late 1960s and 70s, and the rapid adoption of computer applications in archaeology has seen the craft elements of archaeology as maybe being marginalized, right, if not genuinely in decline. The acceleration of archaeological workflows associated with this accelerated modernization of archaeological practice has tended to increase, to complement the increasing pace of academic life, right? I got tenure just a couple years ago. I certainly felt rushed. I still feel rushed. It's because we're running probably a little over. The drive to publish for tenure and promotion and policies in host countries that limit the extent and duration of field work pushes us to work more quickly and to develop efficiencies whenever possible. The pressure across the humanities for big data means that we have to collect more data, and collecting more data often involves digging bigger holes, surveying larger survey areas, or if not surveying larger areas, doing more surveys to have these data sets to convince our colleagues in STEM fields, for example. So the increase in pace over the past century may seem quite natural, embodied as it is in changing archaeological methods, technologies, and realities, but it nevertheless needs to be interrogated for archaeology to continue in a critical way. Most of these slides are just pretty pictures. The most commonly expressed reason for increased use of technology in the field is efficiency, and we've heard this word a lot over the last day and a half. By doing things faster without losing accuracy or precision, archaeological projects can collect more information, more data, typically encoded as bits of data, which allows them to reconstruct archaeological contexts more completely and in less time. Digital tools have assisted archaeologists in standardizing their practices and reinforced trends emphasized in new archaeology. As Catalin Pavel's oddly wonderful little book has demonstrated, these archaeological methodologies manifest themselves in the slow replacement of trench diaries or notebooks with detailed forms that became widely used in the last decades of the 20th century. Of course, I'm aware these things were used really in the first decades of the 20th century, but now no one just has the kind of notebook they write things in, right? Everyone has some form, whether it be on a tablet or paper. While most forms preserve space for interpretation and analysis at trenchside, the dominant trend has been toward more atomized recording, designed to improve accuracy, regularize descriptions for later comparisons, and to facilitate computerized data entry. Today's use of iPads or other tablet computers at trenchside or in the field reproduce the character and structure of paper forms and further streamline archaeological documentation. I'm currently working with the Western Argolid Regional Project. We rely on paper forms and afternoon data entry sessions to transcribe data, and this summer from over 2,400 units. This was a drag. In addition to neatly delineated recording forms and their digital versions, 3D structure from motion photography offers methods to streamline trench and artifact illustration. By baking a trench into a series of individual photographs, we can use software like Agisoft PhotoScan. This is from Brandon Olson's PowerPoint here yesterday, showing one of our EUs from my excavations on Pila Kutsopetria in Cyprus. So I'm a Luddite, but I mean, we still have to use the tools. On a day-to-day basis, it's possible to use these methods to document individual strata in a trench, or at least capture the spatial arrangement of various important contexts at a much greater speed than traditional trench illustration. At the end of an excavation season, when time seems always to be at a premium, my project on Cyprus was able to use structure from motion images that reproduce overhead trench photographs without the inconvenience of erecting a scaffolding or hiring a lift. The time-saving possibilities and increases in efficiency are notable and real. To achieve these efficiencies, both standardized recording and structure from motion photography transformed the archaeologist and archaeological information in similar ways. First, both techniques involve the archaeologist breaking the site into fragments. For recording sheets, this involves dutifully filling in a series of predetermined descriptive fields, ranging from soil Munsell color to dimensions, elevations, and features. It's hardly surprising that survey projects, which developed directly from ideas expressed in new archaeology, particularly the second wave surveys in Greece, relied on forms and digital recording, rely heavily on forms in this kind of digital recording. Structure from motion photographs likewise fragment views of the trench that rely on computer algorithms to reconstruct proper relationships. Anyone who's tried, back in the day when you tried to create a panorama and like line up photographs, and you had to deal with like lens curving things. It was always just crazy. You couldn't measure anything and make them work. I mean, it was just for fun. The process of reproducing these fragmented data sets changes the pace and focus of archaeological work. And I think John's really quite remarkable talk yesterday emphasized this. I mean, it changes the way in which archaeological work is fundamentally organized. Attention to detail has always been central to good archaeological practices, of course. The inefficiencies of traditional archaeological fieldwork, however, often provided opportunities to consider context as a whole. Some of these opportunities for what I call slow archaeology derive from time-consuming processes, like preparing trench plans, drawing scarps, or describing complex stratigraphic or horizontal relationships on the dreaded blank notebook page. Other opportunities, however, require intentionally pulling back from efficiencies to give archaeologists an opportunity to understand space as a unified whole. For example, in the Western Argolid, we asked team leaders to stop recording their detailed forms periodically throughout the day and to look across the landscape to understand the larger context for their work. In other words, to slow down just for a minute. And of course, this totally went by the wayside when we felt like we fell behind. In excavation, the time to handwrite and draw not only slows down the work, but might actually improve our ability to remember relationships. The reason for this are partly haptic. The act of writing and drawing has been shown to improve recall. It's also partly to encourage excavators to discern important moments in the field by marking it with different actions. In other words, moving away from the structure of forms and technical requirements of proper recording creates a record that corresponds in some ways to the differences between technical and personal photographs. The former serves to reproduce an object or situation faithfully, whereas the later serves to reproduce a memory of the event, right? When you take a snapshot, you're not worried about remembering all the people who are at Granny's birthday. You're attempting to remember Granny's birthday or whatever. The fragmented, if more comprehensive, records created by digital practices in archaeology almost always require then some reassembly after the archaeologist leaves the field. To do this, archaeologists leverage an expansive digital ecosystem. Data collected on either digital or paper field recording forms becomes the basis for FileMaker access queries, Excel or R or SPSS calculations, and ArcGIS maps. These pieces of software, as well as the hardware used to collect data at trench site or in the survey unit, functions as parts of this larger system. The ecosystem requires qualified personnel and additional levels of vigilance to maintain the system in which these bits of data make sense. Compared to the relative simplicity of an excavation notebook, in which requires almost no particular technology to read and understand, the modern excavation or survey database is a virtually meaningless mass of encoded data, which is something that Sebastian brought up. Our dependence on technology to reconstruct archaeological contexts becomes even more acute when dealing with the data produced by 3D imaging technologies, for example, which rely on either bespoke, since that's our word, or proprietary software to produce legible results. I understand, of course, that I guess conceivably if you have I don't know, if you're one of these people who can read sheet music and hear the song in your head, you could, I guess, look at point cloud data, which is really just X, Y, and Z, and reconstruct the image, but you'd have to be almost like a cyborg to do that. I mean, I don't think any real human can do stuff like that. I mean, maybe someone, I don't know. Moreover, as participants in this workshop realize as much as anyone, our ability to produce 3D models has existed for quite some time, but they remain difficult to publish outside a few academic publishers, and this is stuff that Rachel's crew has been working on. And remain challenging to preserve in a reproducible way, particularly if you rely on bespoke applications to produce a model that you then draw analytical conclusions from. You would like to reconstruct the entire chain or preserve the entire chain so someone can understand how you messed things up so terribly before. These limitations do not diminish their potential utility, but reveal one side effect of fragmenting our archaeological data in an effort to manipulate it in more efficient and also, more dynamic ways. Without attention to the larger digital and social ecosystem in which our data functions, we run the risk of decontextualizing our archaeological project. The final part of my paper picks up on the theme of digital and social contexts of archaeology and hopefully returns it to a more familiar debate at the center of traditional archaeological practice. I want to appeal to arguments for the relationship between time and space in a digital world. So far, I've argued that digital methods are part of a larger trend to seek efficiency and speed by parsing tasks more finely. I mean, this, of course, is part of this larger trend, right, in the modern world, that this is the assembly line. This is Eric's Taylorism, right, where we're parsing things ever more finely to develop specialization, to actually form our bodies in such a way. And our minds, we've been talking about this, right, form our bodies and minds so they conform to certain expectations that these agents, these objects that we're using, our iPads or our Surface Pros or our laptops, are sort of projecting on us. We like to think we're controlling these machines, but these machines and we are actually working together because we're both constrained to some extent by the limitations that we've placed on, by these co-developed limitations. Okay, so these practices have gone a long way to solve practical problems associated with limits in time, funding, expertise, and workforce, and reflect century-long trends in industry, academia, and even archaeological methodologies. At the same time, the ways in which we have implemented digital tools in archaeology has complicated our efforts to reconstruct archaeological contexts of our excavation or survey units, and ultimately the past. I'd like to try to argue, or at least suggest, maybe just assert, that the quest for efficiency and speed has had a concomitant effect on how we understand archaeological context and space. To make this argument, I appeal to the work of geographers like David Harvey, who describe a phenomenon called time-space compression. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. For Harvey, the increase in speed associated with capitalism, Harvey optimistically calls it late capitalism, or late modernity, has resulted in the, quote, annihilation of time, the annihilation of space by time. In a very basic sense, Harvey is arguing that as we reduce friction in the movement of capital, workforces, and information, the challenges of space begin to dissipate. I'll apply this argument in a rather loose way to archaeology, but I think we can mostly agree that one of the ways in which digital practices have increased efficiency in the field is by moving the place of analysis from the side of the trench to the storeroom, the laboratory, the library, or the faculty office. I think our conversations here have been dominated by the idea of data collection, that we're out there collecting data. Of course, I recognize that, like Rachel's paper, sort of complicated. I mean, I can't just generalize everyone. And I know that we all have more subtle ideas than I'm probably I'm offering a caricature. This is why this is an assertion, not an argument. Fieldwork becomes focused on data collection primarily, and the understanding of those data collected can take place not only at another time, but frequently at another place. To do archaeology in our office, I'm on it, we've become increasingly attached to digital surrogates of archaeological artifacts. There, our baffled look. And I use this term quite broadly here to include both traditional artifacts like potsherds, statue fragments, and architecture, and evidence for archaeological relationships like stratigraphy, soil descriptions, and other environmental data recorded over the course of an excavation or survey. With the most recent advances in easy, cost-effective, and efficient 3D scanning, as the organizers of this conference have helped to develop, it becomes possible to transport a 3D model of an object back to home institutions on a laptop computer. How cool is that? Database scans of notebooks, photographs, and other digital records enable archaeologists to construct archaeological contexts thousands of miles from the location of the physical objects. It seems that the higher the resolution of our documentation, or the more gooder data that we have, the greater the boon to the archaeologists. To be clear, like most people in this room, I've found myself in my office cursing some overlook or misremembered detail invisible in all photographs, descriptions, and even 3D models. I've spent hours spinning the stupid Agisoft model around looking for something. These moments of cursing, however, never fail to remind me that the original context of an object matters. Or to evoke a slightly different discourse, provenience has value. Looted objects are less valuable to archaeologists because the act of looting has rendered them out of place. Moreover, most people in this room would agree that calls for the repatriation of artifacts, whatever the modern political context for such gestures, is important because it enables us to understand the connection between objects and their broader context. To bring all remaining fragments of the Parthenon marbles together within view of the Athenian Acropolis represents an effort to restore the building, its sculptures, and classical Athens to some kind of recognizable whole. Digital surrogates, plaster casts, and scale models simply do not suffice. This being said, I obviously recognize the excavation involves some kind of displacement. We compensated for this displacement of soil and objects by establishing an archaeological context, right? As John and I bantered about at the end of his talk, we record so much data out of this desperate hope that we really haven't wrecked everything. I can prove it, Mom. I can put it all back together, right? The archaeological context, however, has traditionally had a physical connection, even then, with the location of excavation or survey. We tend to localize these archaeological contexts by connecting sites to museums, artifacts to storerooms, and ensuring that appropriate archaeological authorities have final reports, copies of notebooks, and even subsequent publications. Lectures, site tours, and other kinds of outreach are becoming more and more common, even as a site as visually unremarkable as ours at Pila Kutso-Petraea. It's actually in black and white. Like widely supported calls for repatriation, something about archaeology remains unmistakably local. Slow archaeology is not meant to be a solution to a particular problem in contemporary archaeology, but a point of departure for a more substantial critique of our digital future. To my mind, the goals and practices of digital archaeology have often followed larger trends in contemporary society that look to fragmenting processes and data to gain efficiency. This is consistent with both the long-term modern trajectory of archaeology. Modern trajectory of archaeology is a discipline, right, that is born of modernity. And responsive to recent realities, both in academia and in fieldwork. At the same time, our quest for modern efficiencies has the byproduct of collapsing space as much as time. The portable digital surrogates of our work produces, recreates archaeological context of a sort in our offices and provide the basis for our analysis. Even if we argue that archaeological knowledge has always been portable in the pages of academic journals, monographs, technical drawings, and illustrations, digital archaeology takes this, I'd argue, to another level. And it takes to another level our ability to fragment archaeological experience and to use complex tools to reassemble this experience in another time, in another place. Slow archaeology suggests that these digitally mediated acts of displacement are unique products of the last 40 years of archaeological practice and require the same critical attention that we lavish on objects, sites, and landscapes.
Do you want to do questions?
That was a really great talk. I liked it a lot. What you were just saying came home to us when we were working in Bulgaria, and you'd like it in Bulgaria. Bulgarians only use notebooks. They have the most beautiful, extensive. They stop all the time, write extensive notes. It's often very difficult to extract the information that you want out of those. But I saw the value enough to institute a notebook policy for all of our volunteers and students.
And it's fascinating, right? Those places, because they think, we have this idea that somehow that notebook is like a flawed, I'm not saying you're saying this, but it's really easy for us to see that notebook as something that then we have to mine to get information from, rather than actually being the way in which this group of people, the Bulgarians, right, have decided that preserving their past is best suited. And I'm not saying that the Bulgarians couldn't be convinced that using a very sophisticated digital workflow would be better, but still, sorry.
No, that's good. And no, you do see this value. I'm going to, as an relatively unapologetic processualist second wave survey person, I'm going to challenge you a little bit on a couple of these things. Though that I will, having worked on systems that range from handheld GPS and paper to ArcPad and paper, through to the systems we're developing now. Paper is also a technology, and it can also be fragmenting, like John's examples yesterday of those dozens of forms do. And I'd also say that I'll challenge anyone to a race on paper versus any of the databases that you do for surface. I think for excavation, you're probably more right. I haven't done nearly as much excavation as I have surface survey, but we feel like even with the best deployments that we're doing now, if we get 80% the speed of paper in the field, we've won, because the efficiency comes at that stage of not having to digitize, which I think even you made a little bit of a snide remark about that may not be the most contemplative part of working with the data. So
it's interesting, right? Because that. I've thought a lot about digitization because our survey in Greece right now is still typing their data in. And in another version of this paper, I play with the idea that this is actually a useful thing, in the sense that as a sort of field director, I ended up reading all of these forms as they're coming in, because I did a lot of the typing, not all of it, but I did a lot of it. And that's kind of amazing. In fact, working on a legacy data project at Polis Chrysokou on Cyprus, I have taken to transcribing all the notebooks to basically memorize them. And then using what I've memorized, flawed memory, of course, as a way to create hypotheses, which then allows me to go and interrogate the data that I've digitized. And so, especially a survey project that has 5 or 6 field teams out in the field, the only time a director is ever going to get a chance to internalize that data, right? I mean, I'm talking about medieval monks here, transcribing, like hearing the scripture and writing it down. Like, how come they memorized all that stuff? Because that's all they did. But it gave them a certain ability to manipulate data using not boop, boop, boop computers, but actually our brain, that allows us to frame hypotheses that then when we beep, boop, 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 go into our computer, we can actually generate sort of, we begin to, because how often do we come to a database just blank and like alphabetize it, like just start sorting it, or like just plain, never, right? We always want to have some question. So so even something like keying our data, as dreadful as it is, and how much often we outsource it, right? We say, get this away from us, let the worst undergraduate in the field, maybe they can become like the data entry person. That's your specialty. It deprives us of actually learning that data. We become less familiar with our landscape. We become less familiar with our site. Whoever's less hostile. Come on, Matt's like a friend of mine.
Well, I mean, in a sense, though, I mean, maybe the modernist dream isn't so much in tension with what you're saying, because you're also talking about frictions between people and the instruments of observation, right? So if it's easier to write in a notebook and the observation is more direct that way, then that's the best way to go, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's no way to dump archaeology is, at its core, like everything in the academy, like something that is modernist, and it has this tension within it. So, right, I mean, paper is a tool, a pen is a tool, right? Like, I wear eyeglasses, like these were, whatever, hiking boots, all these things are tools that we use. And it's a question of thinking critically about which tools do we deploy at which point to achieve the goals that we want. And it's not saying that any of the things that anyone has done is bad, but it's rather like pushing us to create as equally a robust context for the tools we use and the processes we use to generate archaeological knowledge as we do when we put together our sites and our landscapes to argue about what things, how things worked out in days of yore.
Okay, great. Thank you.